Or how many languages should this be in? Or should we spend some money to translate this into French? The answer is always yes, right? The answer is because it's in our Constitution, because it's in the British North America Act, because it's foundational to the nation. The U.S. doesn't have an official language. So the U.S. has this huge panic about Spanish, for example, because it looks like at some point in the future there will probably be more native Spanish speakers or bilingual native Spanish speakers than native English speakers in the nation, right? So more people who are comfortable in Spanish or equally comfortable in Spanish and English than people who are only comfortable in English. And there's this big panic about whether or not English is the language of America, because no one's ever decided what the language is going to be in America. They just kind of had an unspoken default that's being challenged by circumstance. And I think the UK, you see this very much in play in the UK about what is an English value, what is a British value, how does an English value and a Scottish value different? And you know, I think it's why the BNP gets a lot of mileage, is they make recourse to a set of nebulously defined English values that because they're not written down anywhere, you can anyone who shouts loud enough can make claim to being their defender. And so, you know, you might say, well, English values are about tolerance, and that's why England opened its arms to the Huguenots and the Jews who were fleeing persecution during the pogroms. Or you might say English value is about intolerance, and that's why they threw the Jews out and they all had to go to Amsterdam. You know, like there's no one's ever said which of those incidents was the right one. And which one actually defines Englishism, and how Englishism is different from Britishism.
I want to move us on to some of the internet freedom organisations that you're part of. You're a fellow of the Electronic Frontier Foundation and part of the Open Rights Group over here. But to get us into that, do you think is there some sort of tension between, on the one hand, sort of organising for unfettered freedom of information and stuff on the internet, but at the same time the issues with privacy and surveillance that we've just been talking about? So people at the moment are perhaps worried that young people are putting too much information about themselves on Facebook and they don't really understand that, you know, they don't really get the privacy arguments. Do you think that there's some sort of tension there?
You know, I there is and there isn't, which is kind of a weaselly answer, but the tension. So I think that, first of all, we need to distinguish between three different ways that people give their information out. One is that they choose, possibly in a way that is foolish, to give their information to a company or a government. Another is that a government compels them to give that information. And then the third one is the one that's, I think, least understood, which is that the government funds, either directly or indirectly, the creation of large data gathering private sector entities for whom they are the biggest customer. And so the Credit Reporting Bureau in the US, and I think here, fall under that category. In the US, the rise of Credit Reporting Bureau is simultaneous with the post-Watergate ban on the FBI gathering data on Americans without particularized suspicion. So the FBI was no longer allowed to just open a file on you because they thought you were an interesting person whom they should have a file on. They had to have a reason to open a file. So they, both through venture backing and also just through brooding it about that they would pay for this service, created the American Credit Reporting Bureau, who have essentially opened files on every American, and whom the American intelligence apparatus remains the major customer for, even though there's obviously a lot of private sector customers for them too. So those three cases, I think, are each of them different. I think that the leaving aside the third case, where I think that it's just an end run around the law, and that the lawmakers who told spies you can't spy on people without suspicion need to come back to them and say, and that also means you can't pay someone else to spy on them without suspicion too, because I think that to me seems really clear. It's like, I have a 2-year-old, right? I understand when I say you can't have another cookie, it also means you can't have a cookie now, and it also means you can't ask your mother for a cookie, and it also means you can't go get a cookie for yourself. You can't have another cookie means you can't have another cookie. And like, you know, as the father of a 2-year-old, I understand this, and I think governments should at least be as astute as fathers of 2-year-olds. But the first case of governments gathering information on you without your permission, or compelling you to hand over information, is bad, not just in and of itself because it's unduly invasive, but also because I think it systematically disorders our intuition about the value of our private information. In the same way that if you create a lottery And the American lottery slogan is "You got to be in it to win it," which is about the most innumerate statement you can make, because actually being in it doesn't materially, if you were a statistician, you would say whether or not you're in it, you're not going to win it, in the same way that you're also not going to be hit by lightning or a meteor. I mean, some people are hit by lightning strikes and meteor, but no one actually makes any kind of plans for what to do in that contingency, because the probability is so low that there's no reason to think about it. But by creating lotteries and telling people you've got to be in it to win it, I think we systematically disorder their ability to understand probability and risk. In the same way, when you create systems that compel people to hand over their personal information, you systematically cause them to undervalue that information and to misunderstand the potential consequences of giving it out. When you blithely say, "Oh, we're going to gather all this personal information in this, kind of these centralized databases, and it just won't leak because it's a solvable problem to keep this information from leaking," you cause people to believe that the private sector will avail itself of whatever magic beans the government claims it has access to stop information from leaking, and that there is some way that you can kind of concentrate this diffuse, relatively harmless atoms of kind of private information into the super concentrated, infinitely long-lived and pluripotent kind of information plutonium, where you've gathered all this information together and it now can be kind of weaponized with relative ease and simplicity, and that somehow that's containable. And so I think that's the yes and no answer. The yes and no answer is, I wish people wouldn't give as much money to the private sector, and I think the way that we start getting them to revalue their personal information is to change how the public sector demands and compels their information disclosure.
What about I think this falls into your second point of those three examples. Something like Facebook, which of course is a private entity, but people are freely giving their information because it's fun, but are then in some respects unaware of what that information then goes on to be used for.
So there's an extent to which every game is essentially a Skinner box. It's a behaviorist experiment that using reward and negative reward, that's withholding a reward or even sometimes punishment, to condition people to do stuff. And that's great, and it's terrible sometimes too. And Facebook is a game. I think you said you're right. It's fun. It's a game. It's got a game mechanic. And there's no obvious reason to me why you couldn't design a game mechanic that rewarded people for social play that revolved around not disclosing, right? That revolved around keeping things private. There is I think, a false equivalence between social and disclosure. There's some disclosure necessary for social activity, but some of our most enduring and fun game-like social institutions, like the Freemasons, are built entirely around non-disclosure, not around disclosure, right? So I think that, like, in some Paleolithic moment in the history of social software, maybe it was like when 6 Degrees, which I think was probably the first of these social networks, came about, someone sat down and kind of flipped a coin and came up with a disclosure game instead of a secrecy game. And that was successful, and so the successors to it came along and said, well, what variants can we make on the successful case that will be more successful? How can we pursue this towards a maximum? And they've reached, I think, a local maximum around rewarding people for disclosure. And I think that there's no reason why someone couldn't, both financially and politically, make a success out of a non-disclosure game. In fact, I think that given how much competition there is in the disclosure game space, that the non-disclosure game space, by being relatively untapped, probably has a lot of money waiting to be extracted from it. There's a lot of value for a smart entrepreneur. It's, Brian Eno said that the genius lies in not doing the thing that no one else has not done before. And there's probably that opportunity lurking out there for some smart entrepreneur who wants to design that game.
But that's not going to be a boing boing offshoot anytime soon.
It's possible, but not likely. Institutionally, Boing Boing is both blessed and crippled by the fact that it doesn't really have much by way of an institution. So we have almost no overheads. I mean, we have a managing editor now who's brilliant, Rob Beschizza, who's actually British but lives in Pittsburgh. We've got this kind of Atlantic swap that we've done. But we hadn't actually all been in the same room together for the first 6 years, like ever. We do like 9 phone calls a year, if that, probably more like 5, 1 face-to-face in an average year.